give us a prayer.
Yes, Lord. Bill, come sit here where I can touch you, son. Let us pray. Almighty and everlasting eternal God, we thank you. We thank you for this opportunity. We thank you for this fellowship and this meeting. Lord, remind us, whatever we do and say, you're watching and you're listening. Let us do things that are good for the citizens of Georgia and beyond personal accomplishment. For it is in your precious name we pray. Amen.
We've got, okay, good. We're having technical difficulties today, but welcome everyone to the Transportation Committee meeting. Today we have a couple of reports that's going to present to us. One of the things that happened in House Bill 930 last year is a requirement that the ATL that was established provide a report back to this committee on an annual basis. So we've asked them to come today and do that, and as they're obligated to do through House Bill 930. And then also we asked our largest transit provider in Georgia, MARTA, to also give a presentation about their system and the things that are happening at MARTA, and also to talk a little bit about the largest event we've had in the city in a long time. Super Bowl just occurred, and how that worked from a transit and mobility perspective here in Atlanta. So they'll be coming up, and I know we're waiting on Director Thomason, I believe, who's on the way. But also a couple of reminders for the committee before we get started. We have our transportation dinner on February 25th, so at 5:30, that's a Monday evening. Chelsea will send out some additional information on that, but make sure you have that on your calendar. We had great turnout last year and looking forward to that this year. So that's, again, February 25th. I also want to mention to you, watch your emails next week, because we have quite a few bills that have been dropped later in the session and that we're going to have to attend to. That's got some pretty in-depth policy issues associated with it. We'll be taking those up, a couple of those probably next Thursday. We may also have to schedule some additional meetings between then and crossover day. There'll also, I know, going to be a subcommittee meeting that you'll be getting notice on if you serve on the subcommittee for rail. That Representative Carpenter chairs, that'll be meeting next week. Also, we plan to hopefully roll out our large mobility bill that we've been working on through the Transit Governance and Funding Commission for the last couple of years. We've had meetings with the governor's office and others around that legislation, and waiting on some feedback and some additional comments on that. And we'll be having some other meetings. We also would like to schedule some individual meetings with groups of this committee to go over that in detail so you understand it's a pretty in-depth piece of legislation, about 70 or so pages, but it has the opportunity to really transform how we operate across Georgia. So we'll be getting additional information on that to you. And I think that's all the announcements. Scott, do you know where, could you get started for us, Scott? I mean, we need to, either that or we're going to have to let MARTA go, and that's going to take.
Chairman, I'll be glad to get us started. Chris is parking, so he should be here in any minute now. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to present. I'm Scott Haggard. I'm the Director of Government and External Affairs for the new ATL Transit Authority. And we are very pleased to be able to present to you today at the committee. I know a number of you have been involved with either the House Bill 930 process or certainly the process that we had to elect some board members, and Chris will talk a little bit about that when he gets here. But we very much appreciate your leadership on transit, Mr. Chairman, and the members of the committee on all this. Let's see. So I think most of you are probably familiar with sort of how we got to where we are, which is, let's see, hold on. Okay.
Here,
No, I'm doing the ATL one.
it's going to show you up there.
Oh, there we go. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay, cool. I got it. Thank you. So as you know, this was the ATL was created as a result of.
Go ahead, you can keep going.
Okay.
I'm just going to pick something for you.
Okay.
Sorry. You can keep going.
Okay, all
promise.
right. As you know, the ATL was created as a result of House Bill 930, which was, and here's Mr. Tomlinson, so I will let him pick up from here. Great job filling in.
I told him if I was late for him to do interpretive dance, but I guess he decided to start.
Chelsea, remember you asked me if you could leave. The answer is no.
Yeah, I know.
Because you're the only one that can operate the equipment.
It's okay. Okay, there you go. You're ready.
All right. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Excuse my tardiness, but I'm happy to be here and give you an update on what we've been doing with the Atlanta Region Transit Link Authority over the past months. I hope this works. I don't know how you pull off, because I can't actually see the presentation here. This is going to be more interesting. I might be doing the interpretive dance. So, as you know, House Bill 930 was passed last year and signed into law by Governor Deal on May 3rd. Since that time, we spent a lot of time on the basic stand-ups and basic implementation of a brand new agency. Oh, yeah, I'm good. Don't worry, I've been giving this presentation a lot of places. I know it. From May through November, a lot of time was spent putting in place the initial board. And I'm happy to report that the entire 16-member board is in place today. But I've spent a lot of time talking about the board. I can talk, and I will talk a little bit about the governance. I think the thing that this committee probably wants to know most is the question I'm getting from a lot of people. So what exactly is the ATL? What's it going to do? What's it doing? And how's it going to do it? And that's really what I want to cover for you today. I know it's a little bit small to see, but I believe you all have hard copies of the presentation in front of you. Basically, the ATL is the state's regional transit planning authority for the 13-county metro Atlanta area. We're going to be focusing on regional transit planning. The focus of the ATL isn't operations, though House Bill 930 certainly gives it the power to perform operations. But rather, the focus is strictly on planning. How do we take a regional lens to all of the needed and much discussed transit projects that are coming out of our thriving and vibrant local jurisdictions? How do we pair that up with the various operators, over 10 in this 13-county jurisdiction? And from a regional perspective, how do we determine what those priorities are going to be to help really advance Metro Atlanta, and by extension the state, from both an economic development and what I call an economic mobility perspective, connecting Georgia citizens to the various economic activity centers and job centers. And as you can see, the ATL is going to do this in a couple of ways. We're going to prioritize projects on a regional basis through the creation of a regional transit plan. We're going to promulgate transportation policies, some common standards, things and such in the areas of, say, bus rapid transit. Everyone's hearing this term and terminology, but what does it mean? Because it can mean a lot of different things. We need to have some standards here across the region. And we're going to look at working very closely with the various operators in the region in order to actually deliver on this message and present a united front to the Federal Transit Administration to better increase our chances of attracting much needed federal dollars in transit. So those are some of the what's, how we're actually going to do it. This regional transit plan is going to have at least two components: a 6-year time horizon and a 20-year time horizon. Why those timetables? And again, those time horizons are actually called out in House Bill 930. The reason for those is that there's a federally required transportation plan called the TIP, or the Transportation Improvement Program. We have a 6-year fiscally constrained plan that consists of all transportation projects. The ATL is focused on just those transit projects in there. So we're going to have a plan that lists those projects that are vying for either state or federal funding in that 6-year fiscally constrained window. And that plan and that list of projects will become the universe of projects that can be considered for inclusion into the federally required TIP. So we'll be working in conjunction with the Atlanta Regional Commission, who works on the entire transportation program. But when it comes to transit in this region, those projects will first appear on the ATL's regional transit plan. It's the same thing for the 20-year, we also refer to as the long-range plan, as the regional transportation plan. We'll do the same thing when it comes to transit projects. Those looking out over a longer horizon of 20 years, you'll first see them appear in this ATL regional transit plan. As I stand here today, we're in the process of developing the planning process. And the next step will be to work on producing the ATL's first regional transit plan, which we believe will be in place and actually created before the end of calendar year 2019. That timetable is significant because that will put us in a place where this regional project list is available for inclusion in the next major updates of these federally required plans. So right now, we're holding workshops with transit planning professionals from all across the region to help develop that process. Then we'll turn around and we'll work on actually looking at projects to put them into the plan. House Bill 930 includes certain projects that are grandfathered in, if you will. If the federal funding has already been secured, those projects that were already in the TIP that are transit projects, the projects that are listed in the Gwinnett referendum, if it was to successfully pass, those will go into the plan, but by the terms of House Bill 930, those are grandfathered in. They'll automatically be included, but we'll still go ahead and review those. So spend a lot of time on a lot of detail because that is one of the key activities. In fact, that is probably the core activity of the ATL is the creation of this regional transit plan. It also becomes the place where you would have to first see and identify any projects that would be eligible for consideration for the new transit T-SPLOST, which House Bill 930 allowed. If you're not familiar with those provisions, House Bill 930 created a new mechanism that counties could look at. If they wanted to fund a list of transit projects, they could do an additional sales tax of up to 1% for up to 30 years. But those projects would first have to be listed on this plan before they could even go out for public referendum. So it becomes a place where those would be listed, and the ATL and its staff and its board would work closely with any local jurisdiction that wants to avail itself of that opportunity. The next thing we see the ATL doing is once you have projects that are on the plan, there's a gap in time between having projects on the plan and projects being ready to actually seek federal funding. What we see the ATL doing is issuing letters of support to go along with these grant applications. Going all the way back to the time of Secretary LaHood when he was the Secretary of USDOT, he came to Atlanta, and some of you, I'm looking at Representative Smith, we essentially were chastised for not having a cohesive regional approach to our requests to the federal government. Put quite simply, the federal government was tired of us putting them in a position to play King Solomon and decide which of these competing projects should they consider for funding. They were seeing projects coming up separately from MARTA and maybe this city and maybe from the state. So what we're trying to do, this is not about saying no to any projects. This is about how do we as a region look at these projects, how do we sequence them for funding. And this isn't something that I think is a major gotcha at all. All of the projects that we're looking at, whether you're looking at the Gwinnett referendum, whether you're looking at more MARTA, it's hard to argue against the need for any of them. The reality is there's limited federal funds. So how do we sequence these projects? Chances are, and many of you have heard the Department of Transportation come up here and talk about the environmental process. The same thing holds true in the transit world. These projects don't tend to actually, especially mega projects, line up at the same time. But if they did, how would we sequence them? Because the reality is you're not going to receive major funding for 2 mega projects in the same funding request year. This is why the ATL is needed, so that we as a region can go ahead and plan and prioritize those projects. I already hit on the primary information on this slide, but I did want to bring this up again to dispel a notion. ATL is focused on planning. House Bill 930 did not require or change the existence of any existing operators. There's been a lot of talk, well, the ATL, I guess, is going to take over MARTA or subsume everything. That is not the charge that was put forth in the legislation. Rather, we're going to look at leveraging the operators, trying to find the most efficient ways and try to make it seamless to customers, because the customers don't care about who's the operator. They just want to get efficiently from point A to point B. And so again, that's why I emphasized in the beginning, this is a focus on planning rather than the operations. Now the governance structure. 16-member board, 1 non-voting member who's the chairman of, the commissioner of transportation. And the other 15 members, 5 are appointed at the state level, 1 by the governor, 2 each by the lieutenant governor and the speaker of the House. The remaining 10 members are elected through a caucus process. These caucuses, many of you that were in office in last year participated. It's not unlike the process for election of GDOT board members. The difference is it's a caucus made up of state reps, state senators, county commission chairs, and at least 1 mayor from each of these districts. So as far as I know, this is one of the first times that I'm aware of where you have a state agency where 2/3 of the voting membership of the board are elected by a process that's made up exclusively of locally elected officials. This is in large part in recognition of the fact that one of the key components for funding transit is the local funding that's used as utilized as a match. This is meant to be inclusive and require a collaborative process with various local jurisdictions. Hit on most of the things here. The regional transit plan will cover any of those projects coming out of those districts, but for those 13 counties. And I already discussed the transit funding mechanism. One of the other components is regional unified branding. Branding is mentioned in House Bill 930 in 3 places. 2 of the provisions are speaking directly to MARTA, and 1 speaks to the entire region. The MARTA provisions require that starting January 1st of 2019, the ATL logo and brand needs to be incorporated on any new vehicles that MARTA is buying over a certain value threshold of $250,000. So if you notice, and next time you're looking at a MARTA bus, usually in the rear quarter panel, you'll start seeing the ATL logo. Again, I want to publicly commend our partners at MARTA. While they were working on the union negotiations, getting ready for the Super Bowl, we also worked together and got that rolled out. You can see a picture at the bottom of one of the MARTA buses with the ATL logo. The other 2 images is really representative of where we are in the branding process and conversation. We're engaging our partners from around the region because we think the States Express service should be the next one to determine what we're going to do with ATL branding. So you see 2 concepts. The one on top is what I would refer to as co-branding, same approach that was taken on the MARTA fleet. The one in the middle is just a conceptual drawing, not saying that's what it would look like exactly, but you do have the possibility of a rebranding. So ATL could become a known brand in service. These are some of the questions that the ATL board is going to look at and wrestle with, and we're starting though by engaging the marketing and communication professionals from all the operators to look at this. Incidentally, I said there was 3 places branding was mentioned. One was that January 1 date for any new assets that MARTA has. By January 1 of 2023, MARTA is to include the ATL logo on all their properties. The other mention says that the regional transit plan must include a plan for regional unified branding that applies to all transit services within the region. That one doesn't have a timetable, but those are some of the ongoing conversations. Are we going to go down the path that the ATL becomes the branding that becomes recognized for everything that has to do with transit operations? Or do we go down the path of, if you see the ATL logo, and it could be something that's co-branding, you know that this is part of a connected network, because we're going to look at things such as common fare policies and certain standards. So you would know it's part of the same network. Many of you look like you're in the same age group as me. Think of that approach similar to when debit cards first came out. First, it only worked at your bank. Then you said that logo saying it was part of this connected network of systems. This is one of those decisions that the ATL board will have to continue to look at. And of course, we're not going to do this in a vacuum. Many of you have seen various iterations of proposals for the ATL, its structure, its budget. We're not looking to be a substitute for everything that's out there. This is about how do we connect it to a more cohesive, user-friendly network. But I want you to notice that in addition to the public entities that we all think of when we think of transit, we listed Bird, Lyft, Uber. These are things which a lot of people are looking at on how to regulate them. And we think there's a place because safety needs to come first. But the reality is people are riding these scooters. The ATL is going to look at how do we integrate even that into our network in a responsible way, because we're wrestling with these decisions right now. For us, transit is simply anything that moves people en masse, anything that's focused on getting people from where they are to where they want or need to be. Lastly, I talked a lot about some of the concepts, but what's on the screen there is our proposed schedule for board action. The ATL board is meeting, as far as their meetings, pretty much every other month. In between, there are going to be various committee meetings and some work sessions. But what you have on the slide is the dates for all of the ATL board meetings for the rest of calendar year 2019 and some of the key activities. So March 7th will be our next board meeting. They're looking at some bylaw amendments, finalizing the governing principles that will guide the planning process. The ATL working group structure, we're figuring out exactly how the ATL will work with the federally required MPO, Atlanta Regional Commission, setting up a work group of transit executives across the region so that this information really needs to be fed from the ground up. And so we're setting up those groups over the next few months. If you look at May, May is when we plan to have the new ATL planning process approved. So between the March meeting and May, we'll be working to socialize that process with those that are involved in planning throughout the region. If you come to August, proposed regional transit project list for state bond funding. In House Bill 930, the General Assembly put a provision that said the ATL board could submit a list of projects for the governor, the House, and the Senate to potentially consider for inclusion for funding in the bond package. So that proposed list would be approved by the board in August, so it could be submitted by the statutory required date of September 1st. And as you can see from there, by November, by September or November, we want to produce and have the board adopt the first regional transit plan. And then lastly, again, another House Bill 930 requirement is that we provide an annual report and an audit of all transit operations within the region back to the General Assembly and the Governor's Office by December 1st. So this is some of the activity. To get to December 1, we'll have to start on that work. essentially now. So we'll be working with the board and probably working with outside contractors in order to meet that statutory date. So I know I gave a lot of information, but I hope that also shows we're doing a lot of work. The board is engaged. We're meeting, we're reaching out to our partners, be they operators. You'll start to see and hear us doing more publicly in the region. My team is trying to kill me. They're trying to get me in front of every single county commission of the 13 counties within the next 45 days or so. I'll be speaking in front of Fulton County Commission in the Fulton Mayor's meeting tomorrow. And but this is about getting the word out and seeing how we can be collaborative and effective and a value add in this region. We're going to end up with some transit planning expertise, because as counties continue to look at these plans, a lot of them don't have transit planning experts on staff. So the state really is providing a valuable resource to help communities continue to look at whether transit is right for them or not, and how they can go about making those determinations in a effective and efficient manner. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, I apologize for being a few minutes late.
All right, thank you. And we know that your board's just now getting up and running, so we look forward to continuing to watch your progress. Representative Carpenter.
All right, I'll just be loud. Just a quick question. Do you have any kind of figures as far as what if we went straight rebranding all the way across all the segments would cost? And in that rebranding, will there be like a single card that accesses all the different systems? Is that the goal and the plan?
I don't have a figure. That's one of the things we're going to look at. Thank you for your question, because I really think there's two things. You have this whole concept of rebranding, and I can tell you people feel very passionate one way or another. But the second part of your question, I think, is the key. We will get back to you, and we can figure out how much it would cost in paint and time to do that. But if we don't address how these disparate systems work together between, say, common fare policies, the rebranding won't matter, or it could even lead to confusion. So we're engaged in conversations on some of the technology standards that would have to be in place. And we're gearing up to have some of the policy discussions. Should everything be flat fare the way MARTA does it, or should it be distance-based? Should we have a regional fare product so that it works on CobLink and MARTA, and there's free transfers? And so we're exploring both of those in parallel. So I know it doesn't answer your question on the money, but I want you to know we're going to figure that number out. But we are working on really a lot of the key things that have to happen under the hood to have a truly seamless network.
All right. I believe it's Representative Prince. No. Oh, I'm sorry, Representative Garner.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And you've made a remarkable progress. I sure hope the fares and the systems work gets all ironed out before the rebranding occurs. But my question is a follow-up question on the branding. Have you able to work out with the fare systems any way to help covering the expenses of, which could be considerable for some of the systems?
We have not come up with a way that would fund rebranding. The work that MARTA's done to date by adding the logo, they largely did in-house. The work that Express would do, we're literally in the process of getting quotes on what it would take to just add the ATL brand.
So you're doing that for the Express system?
Yeah, we're going to look at it for the Express system. I feel strong. It's not because I'm executive director of both, but this is a state agency. This is a requirement in state law. I think the state service should be consistent with the will of the legislature. So we're looking at those costs. I would say this: if the region and the board decides to go with a rebranding over time, I think it's be exactly that over time. As we purchase new vehicles, I mean, oversimplifying a little bit, but you get a free paint job, right, when you buy it. And so the question is figuring out what it would look like coming out of the factory, as opposed to paying the money to repaint everything. So again, I'm not the board, I'm the interim executive director, but obviously if that was the direction we were going, I would see a phased approach as assets age out and they're coming newly painted as the most cost-effective way to move in that direction.
And I guess my question really was, do you anticipate helping each system in the way that you're helping some? I mean, equally with the mandate to rebrand?
We would help them, but in terms of funding, House Bill 930 didn't address the funding component of the branding plan. So we would, depends on what the General Assembly would
Well,
like
I
to
know,
do.
I know it would be something we'll need to work on, but it
Yes.
sounds like an unfunded mandate we sometimes hear about.
Well, and I think just to add to that, that it's important to note that we did not put a date certain for that reason, so that it could be done over a period of time. And
That's
as, like
correct.
you said, as you purchase new equipment, that equipment's going to be painted a certain color and branded a certain way. So, Representative Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Director. You said that you're interim director now?
Yes.
I'm gonna ask you just quick, maybe 3 questions, but they're short answers. You're the interim director now?
Yes, sir.
And is there a search for a new director?
Not that I'm aware of right now.
Okay. Want
If
to keep it
there
that way?
is, and
You want to
I'm
keep it
not
that way?
aware,
No.
that's no trouble.
What's your operating budget and what's your current staff in terms of how many in personnel and what you're looking to grow it out to?
Okay, so the ATL's current operating budget, we received $1.95 million through government deal for transfer emergency fund. So that was the operating state budget, if you will. We looked at pairing that with some unused Greta fund balance for about $600,000. Then we were able to attract, I believe it was $2 million in federal funds. Looking for my team. Giving us approximately a $4.5 million budget when you look at federal and state. But those were, I want to emphasize this, those were one-time funds. So as we go through this year's budgeting process, the General Assembly will be establishing the true base budget for the ATL. And in the governor's proposal for FY20, there was a budget of $2.487 million in state funds in his recommended proposal.
Okay, and how many employees?
Currently, there are 9 positions, 7 of which are filled. Now, the ATL is co-located with my other staff at State Road and Tollway Authority in Greta. So the ATL does not have and is not paying for HR staff, procurement staff, IT staff. So we feel we're being extremely efficient by leveraging the talent that we already have in place in these other agencies. I often get asked, how's it that you're running 3 separate agencies? I'm not. I'm privileged to lead a talented, dedicated team of employees who are fulfilling the mandates of 3 state entities. And we're focused on mobility, whether it's a car in Peach Pass, whether it's transit, and that's the approach. But the answer to your question as far as ATL dollars, those were the rough figures, and I'm certain I'll be talking to the General Assembly more about budgets before this session's over.
All right, thank you, Director.
Thank you.
All right. Next up, we have Virgil, or I think you're going to lead us off, Virgil Flood with MARTA.
Great.
Thank you. Virgil, just introduce once you get started, introduce yourself. Some of these folks are new, so they may not know you and not know your background.
Great, thank you. Don't go anywhere. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Virgil Flood. I'm the Assistant General Manager for External Affairs at MARTA. I've been there for just over 3 months. Joining me today are members of our team, Colleen Kiernan, who's Senior Director of Government Affairs, Justin Kernan, who's Government Affairs Manager, and Lee Shu Kennedy, who is also a Government Affairs Manager, who has been with MARTA for much longer than the other three of us. We're all relatively new. Lee Shu has kept us much informed about the history of MARTA. And so for the members of the committee, the chairman asked us to come today and to provide a little bit of history of MARTA, a bit about what we are doing today, what some of our plans are for the years to come, and to give you a little bit of a snapshot of the Super Bowl, which was a little event that we had some responsibility for over the last couple of weeks. It kept us busy. So we'll talk a little bit about MARTA's history. This year, we're celebrating our 40th year of transit work in the Atlanta area, but we've actually been around for much longer than that. MARTA's history is well over 40 years. Go up.
Give us a second. Technical difficulties. Let me see. Okay, just hit the down button. and
Okay,
it'll work down for you.
great. So in essence, MARTA has been around since the early 50s. The original planning for transit began well before the MARTA Act or any of the jurisdictions began doing work. There was actually, initially, bus service was provided by the Atlanta Gas Company, and MARTA purchased the assets from the gas company some years ago, back in 1971. Could I get that screen? Can you bring that screen up to here?
Wasn't one of these links?
Yeah, that's the, go back to the beginning of that one. That's the end.
Okay.
So, yeah, there we go. Go back some more.
It's just not gonna do it at the same time for both.
Okay, so,
It's not gonna do it for
All
both
right.
at the same time. So if you wanna change it over there, you have to be here.
all right, so why don't you,
It's only gonna change on one screen
okay,
at a time.
we'll go through this pretty quickly then.
Okay. Just hit down.
All right. So 1970s was sort of the beginning where we saw the MARTA Act pass, which gave us the ability for 5 counties in the city of Atlanta to create, to allow for MARTA in their jurisdictions. Can't see. So the first funding for rail began in 1975. The first rail stations opened in 1979, June 30th. And so this map may be a little difficult for you to see, but this begins the east-west line and shows where we started the initial MARTA stations, starting from Avondale to 5 Points and out west to Hamilton E. Holmes. A little bit of what the construction looks like. And 1980s saw some additional expansion where we're now creating train stations along the north-south corridor, going from the airport up to Chamblee. I think this is the 90s. The 1990s was quite interesting because this was the time of the Atlanta Olympics, and probably for maybe the last time, if you've driven through Atlanta, where you could drive downtown without worrying about traffic, because everybody was encouraged to use MARTA, and not many people were driving on the freeway. So if you wanted to drive into the city then, it was quite easy to do. We also went from a coin-based or a token-based system to a Breeze card system. 2000 saw some additional expansion. We rebranded the lines and changed from station destination points from Airport and North Point to color-coded systems. Red and gold lines are north-south, and the blue and green lines are east-west corridors. In 2014, we saw for the first time since 1971, Clayton County was the first jurisdiction to be added to the MARTA system since the first passage in 1971. One thing that we're particularly excited about at this point, and it's happening now and we'll continue to do much more of this, is something called transit-oriented development. It allows us to use our existing assets and real estate around train stations to build work, live, play communities. It gives us a chance to utilize those assets and have communities where we can provide housing, office buildings, retail, shopping, dining experiences, provides more walkable communities, gets people out of cars and using other modes of transportation, including bicycles, scooters, mopeds, Uber, Lyft, all of the other modes of transportation. We've got several of these in place now, including Edgewood Candler Park, Chamblee, Hamilton E. Homes, and there are quite a few more to come. Also, in the last couple of years, we purchased the streetcar from the city of Atlanta. So that's a bit about our history, and let's go back to what we're doing now. I think we can. Go back to the presentation.
Why don't you follow this and I'll move this forward.
Okay, she got it.
Can you see it from here now?
Yeah, she's got it here. That's it.
Okay, so on this slide.
Great. Oh, that's not it. We want to be here.
You want to start on the next one? Just have this.
All right, so MARTA is the 9th largest system in the country. We're actually the 9th largest in rail. We're about 16th in bus. We have about 760 million passenger miles. 127 million passengers use the MARTA system every year. We've got an annual operating budget of $461 million and a capital budget of $434. We've balanced our budget for the last 7 years consecutively, and over the last 40 years or so, we've moved over 3.5 billion people throughout Fulton, DeKalb, and most recently Clayton counties. We've got a significant commitment in the community. We generate about $1.4 billion in economic activity each year and create or are involved in the creation of about 25,000 jobs. We've got 338 rail cars serving 38 rail stations. We've got 211 Lyft vehicles, which are part of our paratransit systems. We are governed by a board of directors. Each of the jurisdictions get an opportunity to appoint members to the board. Fulton County gets 4, the city of Atlanta gets 3, DeKalb gets 3, Clayton County gets 2. There are also 2 ex officio. Chris Tomlinson, who was just in front of you, is a member of our board ex officio. And so we anticipate if, in fact, the Gwinnett referendum passes in March, they will have 3 members as well. Our current board chair is Frida Hartage, who is an appointee from Fulton County. The vice chair is William Floyd, who's from DeKalb County. The secretary is a former state representative, Roberta Abdul Salam, and the treasurer is the former chair, Mr. Robbie Ash. And you see the other members of the board from each of the representative counties. So some of our expansion plans, we've been working for years, and as I mentioned, since the 1950s, we've been involved in planning. We've worked with the ARC as well as the jurisdictions, DeKalb, Fulton, Atlanta, and Clayton, to develop a range of transit planning options, and we're anticipating a number of new projects over the next few years. So some of the projects that we anticipate, by the way, if you look back at, again, a little hard perhaps for you to see, but back in 1980, this was what it was anticipated as a build-out for MARTA. We're not quite there yet, but we're much further along, and with the expansions that we see and anticipate over the next few years, will be much closer to what we envisioned 40 years ago. The most significant expansion is in the city of Atlanta. Back in 2015, they passed a half a penny referendum that will generate about $2.7 billion for transit. It's the first significant investment in transit in about 40 years. It represents an opportunity for a partnership between MARTA and the city of Atlanta, and really provides an opportunity for greater mobility, aligns with the city's growth for vision for growth, and it combines state, federal, and local funds to make this happen. Some of the projects will allow us to employ some new technologies. For its existence, MARTA has pretty much done two things: buses and heavy rail. The projects in Atlanta will allow us to employ 3 or 4 different technologies that are new to Atlanta, not necessarily new to the other communities in the U.S., but we will do light rail. So we're familiar with heavy rail. We will employ something called light rail transit, which is what will be used on the Clifton Corridor. And light rail basically is used in cities. It's 1 or 2 cars. It's typically done on it's an electric powered system. Quite often you will see them powered by overhead power lines. We'll also use commuter rail. That's going to be employed in Clayton County. That is essentially still heavy rail, but instead of running every 10 minutes or 15 minutes, it's at a very fixed period of time at 10:10 in the mornings or 8:10, and it will run essentially based on commuter patterns. The commuter rail is particularly functional when you're trying to join outlying cities into a major core, central core like Jonesboro or Lovejoy into the city of Atlanta. We'll also use something called bus rapid transit, which is dedicated bus lanes, and it will offer some priority signalization. So when the buses are at intersections, buses in the bus rapid transit system will be given priority. And the other new technology we will use is sort of a hybrid. It's called arterial rapid transit. It's buses that are prioritized for signalization. They don't necessarily have dedicated lanes, but they will be given a priority when it comes to signal and lane use. Clayton County, I mentioned there are 2 new programs in Clayton. One's the bus rapid transit that I just mentioned. That will run along 2 existing state routes, State Route 85 and State Route 139. That's sort of the blue route on the western side of the county. Through the center and eastern part, north to south, we will connect from East Point, going through Morrow and Jonesboro down to Lovejoy along a Norfolk Southern rail corridor. DeKalb County is undertaking a transit master study. DeKalb is extremely important to us. 34% of all the 34% of our service areas in DeKalb. 36% of the population in the service area lives in DeKalb, and in 2017, 25% of DeKalb contributed 25% of the MARTA sales tax revenue. We anticipate that the study that's being conducted now in DeKalb will be completed in July. We anticipate that with great eagerness to look for ways that we can partner more closely with the County of DeKalb. Fulton County conducted and completed a master transit plan in 2018. It calls for a variety of transit expansions, including bus rapid transit along Georgia 400. GDOT is employing or installing express lanes along Georgia 400, and so we'll have an opportunity to combine again Fulton County, GDOT, and MARTA in a program to offer more transit options in the Georgia 400 corridor. There's also a BRT plan for South Fulton Parkway, Holcomb Bridge, and Roosevelt Highways. As I mentioned earlier, Gwinnett County has entered into an agreement with MARTA to provide service should the voters in that county decide to say yes to the referendum that is slated for March the 19th. Early voting there starts on February 25th, so Monday. So if anyone lives in Gwinnett, you know that you have an opportunity to vote in Gwinnett starting on Monday, with the last day of voting on March the 19th. That will provide essentially rail service from our Doraville station up to Jimmy Carter Boulevard, and provide fairly soon, if the referendum passes, enhanced bus service, both more service and more routes. And there will be a network of bus rapid transit, arterial rapid transit, and enhanced bus service in Gwinnett should, again, that referendum pass next month. And last, we had, I think, from all accounts, an outstanding performance. And it was certainly not just MARTA. If you look at overall the perceptions and the feedback that we've gotten, not only did MARTA do well, but the city of Atlanta did well. The state of Georgia did well. We put on a phenomenal event. The only downside to the Super Bowl was a very low-scoring game, and the Patriots won one more time. Aside from that, everything was great. So here's a little video that we want to show you. It's on the last page. The video is short, but it's, I think, extremely powerful, and captures the essence of what people felt like when they left the experience at the Super Bowl.
Do you mind?
Go ahead, Representative Jones.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Flood. Mr. Flood, at the last meeting, when you all presented at the MARTOC committee, which I'm a member of,
Sure.
The chairman had mentioned, the CEO had mentioned that he had done a performer based on coming up with negotiations with the union, and I'd asked for a copy of it. I haven't received anything yet. Would you let him know I'm still waiting for the copy of that performer?
Yes,
He said,
yes, Representative Jones,
Thank
I will follow up on that. Thank you.
While we're waiting on the video, Representative Carpenter.
Thanks. So is there anything preventing you guys, as we go through this rebranding process, of selling advertisements to kind of help pay for that?
We sell advertisements as a matter of course. That's a part of our revenue pro forma. We
Sure.
do sell advertising. So on buses, in the rail stations, on benches, in bus shelters. So we already do that.
I was just thinking on the side of the bus, maybe pay for that wrap or whatever.
We sell, again, advertising on sides of buses now. You'll see any number of organizations who advertise with us already.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Not sure, number 25. Okay. Go ahead, Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Flood, as well. Very informative presentation. One of the questions I had, especially with the expansion of your light rail, and I know that this is we're focused on transportation and transit options, but I just wanted to know if you could maybe shed a little bit more light on how MARTA is moving forward with being able to secure its network. I think, as my career, from working, signing up thousands of arrest warrants, of which some of those are coming through MARTA, police force there. And I know that certain residents have, or some residents have kind of expressed some apprehension about the expansion of light rail or other transit options that, it carries a stigma of crime. And so I did want to know, from your standpoint, have you been able to assess as to, what MARTA is actually going to be able to do to help protect the expansion of those lines, to make sure that they're taking care of people's safety as well?
Sure, Representative. And safety and security is obviously very important to us. And to your point, there is a difference between the perception and the reality of crime. I think if you looked at overall the number of crimes that happen in MARTA stations or around MARTA is no greater than what happens in the general population. So we don't attract, we don't enhance, we don't necessarily contribute to crime in any meaningful way. We have a very significant and highly regarded, highly trained police force. We are the 9th largest police force in the state. We've been recognized for outstanding service, for quality of service, for training, and for being able to address difficult situations without any shots being fired or any major issues being identified. We take very seriously the importance of people's security, both in terms of the community as well as the riders on our buses and trains. Before any of you guys leave, you got to see this video, so please, if you would bear with me 1 second. No audio.
Yeah. Can you help me?
So, can
This
you
one?
pause? You can go back to the beginning. That's fine. Just leave it there. I think two big takeaways. We moved over 600,000 people. We operated 4 days, 24 hours a day. We generated about $3 million in Breeze card sales. We had over 3,200 hours of volunteer time. I spent personally 12, 14 hours working as a volunteer, helping people to navigate the system. We had just extremely positive feedback from members of the press, and more importantly, the fans who came to visit our great city. Be happy to take any other questions if you have them, sir.
And from what I understand, the city's put in requests to be considered in a pretty short time frame for another Super Bowl.
I
right?
certainly hope so.
That's right. Good. Well, good. Well, thank you for helping make Atlanta look good. Are there any other questions? All right. It looks like. But thank you very much for that presentation and for what all you do.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members.
All right. Well, I think we've got our obligation out of the way from a transit perspective this year for the ATL report. We expect that to look a lot different next year with as they continue to get up and running. next week, expect a busy transportation week. We have several bills coming forward, including some of the things that Director Tomlinson talked about with scooters. There's some bills around scooters, electric bicycles, and other things that we're going to be taking a look at. So we'll be here next Thursday. Thank you, and we're adjourned.